Present time in the Undercroft Gallery, we have 30 years of your work. What's your reaction to the early paintings when you see them again?
Well, it's quite complicated in a way, because a number of the paintings of those early ones are 52, and are done after I'd been to England. But there are also a number there which are done before I went to England. So it's very interesting for me to see what happens with these early paintings, where I'd only been influenced by Europe at second-hand through reproductions. And I can see those paintings there, and they're very Australian, Australian landscapes. And then I was once told by a chap from England, a rather famous chap, he looked at it and he said, well, you have two choices. At least you'll have an alternative. He said, you can either stay here and paint forever Australia, he said, which in a way I would advise, or you can go to Europe, in which case I don't know what will happen, but whichever way it is, the die will be cast. If you stay here, your painting will go one way, and if you go to Europe, something will happen to you. He was European, he was English. And I can see in these early paintings, some are 48, in the so-called, not so-called, but in the Tom Collins collection, and they're very Australian. Then these other paintings show the influence of what happened to me in Europe. And since this is a question that I continually have juggled with myself over the next 30 years, those early group of paintings do represent to me a kind of reminder of when I was younger and made the decision to go to Europe, and the irrevocable thing which happens, that the radiation of the European civilization, or whatever it's to be called, acts upon you, and then you've taken that fatal step. You forevermore have this need to be in one place and then the other place.
Indeed.
And but for aeroplanes, of course, I would have been swimming backwards and forwards.
Right. Have your working methods altered very much during this time?
No, I have basically the same method of working, but I'm fairly methodical in that I worked in a factory. I'm so to speak, a process worker. I'm a method worker. That is, because of the drying speeds of different kinds of paint and lacquer and water and wax and all the things I use, I work like a man would at a machine, and that's remained with me, that early training, and my paintings, although perhaps they don't reflect that on the surface, they might look like highly spontaneous thing, and in fact that's, I suppose, what I'm known for in many ways. But basically I'm a creature of method. I don't think by temperament, but by accident of the way I entered life and the circumstances I was in socially. I had to learn to adapt to factory methods. So the paintings do show a methodical kind of stage, technically, but I hope in the end that the opposite thing happens, that you look as if they've just been breathed on.
Sure. Does drawing play a significant part in the process of getting to a painting?
Well, some painters do drawings as a sketch for the formal kind of display of the elements in a painting, and then they follow that and make a painting of it. But I don't do that at all. I rehearse in my mind the jigsaw elements of a painting, and keep on juggling them around until I'm mentally satisfied that that's the way the patterns, the bits will fit. and then I put it down. Well, it always comes out differently, of course, from what you've conceived it.
Sure.
There comes a point when sometimes it becomes the opposite, or sometimes you're lost, you lose the thread. But I don't ever do drawings for paintings.
Right.
But I do a lot of drawings as for drawing's sake.
Sure.
I love doing drawings.
The act of drawing.
Yeah, for a drawing, yes, I love doing that. And it isn't any different from doing a painting at all. It's the same wrist action. But the technicalities of it are quite different. For the reason I've just explained, that painting is that sort of process method, whereas drawing is you only have the one crayon in your hand, or sometimes now I use 3 or 4 in a cluster, and just draw. But basically, drawing for me is drawing, and painting is painting, and I don't think, or very rarely, use one as a basis for the other.
And what for you is a successful painting?
A successful painting is, well, first of all, as you can guess, when you're faced with a blank canvas, it's the usual.
Terrifying, isn't it?
It's the terrifying thing, and it's the mental block. You see, you're very frightened of doing a painting, even though you've gone to bed with a painting on your mind, and you get up in the morning and you're quite relaxed and everything else, and you just have your coffee and everything else. But nonetheless, you rather dread this particular moment. And usually what happens is that when you go in the studio, I think this is perhaps true of a lot of painters, you put on some Mozart, or whatever you like. Most painters seem like Mozart.
Do you create a mood?
Yes, and you sit there and you perhaps pick up a book, or you look out the window, or you scratch your nose or your ear or something, and you listen to Mozart, and you sort of pace around a bit, very completely privately, in some kind of mood which is difficult to describe, but which is very concentrated, at the same time very loose. You haven't any focus, except that you have the thing there, and you really don't want to do anything to it,
of course,
because what you're going to do to it is likely to be wrong. And if you make a mistake, then you're defeated, and if you're defeated, well, you feel that the day's ruined, and you've had this feeling before, and it's like getting a belting, or nothing like it. So what happens is that at some point you just go and you take the brush and you start, and off you go. Well, a successful painting is one in which 2 hours later somebody knocks on the door and says lunch is ready.
Right.
Then you know it's been okay, because you've been lost in the free kind of...
Sure.
You've prepared yourself very rigidly in a mental way, and as I say, rehearsing all these bits of the jigsaw puzzle. But basically, in a painting which goes well, it's very free and you and unconscious in one sense. Well, that's the word that I shouldn't use because it's not the correct word. But you can do things in that mood which you couldn't do in cold blood.
And what about the overkill, the number of Nolan paintings we'll never see, that were painted out or whatever? Well,
there comes a point in a painting where you have, the fork in the road. You have 2 paths to take, and it's like setting a compass on a ship or an aeroplane or anything else. It's programming the computer which way you're going to go. And if you take the left-hand fork and it's the wrong one, you come bang up against an impossibility. In that case, you have a slight chance of finding a detour back to the right path, or you perhaps haven't. And if you haven't, then the painting's finished. You see, you've hit a brick wall, and all you can do is put the painting down against the wall and leave it there.
Do you work on one at a time, or 2 or 3, or?
No, I work on one at a time.
One at a time.
And I work on make or break.
Sure.
You see, I don't give myself a second chance. I don't give the painting a second chance. I don't fight it past the point where it's going to fight me. I mean, we just get to a consensus that if I'm going to cut its throat, it's going to cut mine. You see what I mean?
Sure.
So, but when I was younger, of course, I did do these battles, and I spent all night wrestling with the painting and cursing and swearing, and I've been beaten, and I've remembered for weeks. I've looked at the thing and it's haunted me, and I remembered all the effort I'd put into making it beautiful or to resolving my painting intention, and I've failed. So it's just like any other situation. You failed. And you might say to yourself, well, I failed because it was a bad night or a bad breakfast. I mean, but nonetheless, it's a failure.
What about the way that imagination works in your painting? In the early paintings, in the Nolan room particularly, one is very conscious, I think, of a terrifically fertile, imaginative perception of the world. At least that's the way I would think of them. How do you regard imagination as an artist in terms of your own work?
Well, I think it's a kind of triple bill in a way. First of all, you have your own self, you know, your own solar plexus and your brain and your likes and your dislikes, your personality. That has its demands. You then have the history of paintings stretching back, and other people have painted, and there's Lascaux, and there's such a thing as art, and you wish to be part of it. So there are certain restrictions. You feel that you that you have to, that you have to be contained by. And then thirdly, you are trying to assess in some way in yourself what is going on in the community. I mean, what is the community thinking about? What what are its myths? What are its unconscious, or I've used the word again, and I don't like to use it, but what are its subterranean desires, which it cannot explain to itself, but which are there, which are latent, and of course in conversation, and even in this conversation, we are aware that we're trying to reach some point,
Indeed,
but we're not quite sure what it is. So, but you have that responsibility as a painter. I think you have no direct relationship to society. I don't think, in a social sense, but you do have a responsibility as a member of a group of people to assess their desires. I mean, you don't ask their permission, of course. It's not like that, but you do feel this need.
Right.
So you have this amalgamation of the, as I've just said, of the three things: your personality, your brain, the fact that you are using paint, therefore you're part of a long tradition of scratching around on stones like the Aborigines or Lascaux or Rembrandt or anything else. There's art. And then there's the other thing of assessing the community's needs, yes. And all this, of course, is quite enough to be going on with walking into the studio.
Sure. Now, a great deal of your power as a painter, which is considerable and has been over a long time, has been released through the use of mythological themes. Could you tell us, perhaps, why did you pick sort of Ned Kelly as an idea? What's behind that?
Well, the literal part of the story is that as a kid I saw Ned Kelly's armour in the aquarium in Melbourne. The other part is that my grandfather, quite truthfully, I mean, you know, some people think it's a made-up thing, but in fact he was a policeman at Beechworth, and he was chasing Ned Kelly, and so as a kid I was told about this episode. Not as an exotic thing or anything, but as a quite natural thing. So that was that, and then I forgot it. But after the war, I had to think out things a bit differently, having gone through the army and all that. And I've been groping around for something to put against the Australian bush, which was, so to speak, the opposite of it. There was the bush; it was all scribbly and it was dappled, and we all knew about it, but it was, as Lawrence says, it's kind of incomprehensible or something. But it needed something against it, I felt, that was its opposite. And I rather suddenly saw that all these things I'd heard about as a kid and all that kind of thing, that Ned Kelly was in fact his armour, as a formal device, as a completely clear-cut black thing, was the opposite of the Australian bush. Was the dead opposite. And from there, the sociological aspects and the mythological aspects became clearer, because it was a kind of insurrection. He was a criminal, but nonetheless he had a lot of popular support, and all these other factors came in. And I then developed what was a very unfashionable concept in 1945 and 46, the idea of a series of narrative paintings.
Sure, right.
But that was not at all popular. I mean, nobody in Australia at that point, or very few people indeed, thought it was a good idea. I mean, now they say, why don't you do more Ned Kelly's? But then they said, please don't do any.
Because you have been telling a very elaborate story for a long time, haven't you?
Yes, I've been using Kelly. People say you've been repeating yourself, you can't think of anything else to do. But it's not like that. I'm just still preoccupied with Kelly as he fits in with our particular form of consciousness here.
What about other myths that have attracted you, like Leda and the Swan, for example? That was another myth that seemed to...
Yes, well, Leda and the Swan, they're actually all rather dark paintings, and somebody remarked it's a funny thing that this painter who painted these high-keyed Australian paintings with lots of light should go to a Mediterranean myth and make it very dark, because I used polyvinyl acetate painting and I used it as an emulsion. It was all very dark in the technical way which I did it, and that was highly technical, the way I did those paintings, and they all came out very dark indeed. But that was because in some way I was trying to respond to something myself about the English landscape, although once again that's a bit hard to convey, but it was my response to the darkness and the greenness and all that kind of thing. And so half of it was to do with this feminine aspect of the myth, and the other was to do with this dark greenness, which was the opposite of Australia. And besides, I was up to my old preoccupation, apparently, of trying to dig in to that community, into the... And even though it was their myth, and in a sense I was an intruder, I actually didn't care about that.
No, of course not.
You know, that's all right. And later on I had an exhibition at the Albury Festival in which I used the Leda and Swan as the beginning of the Trojan Wars, or the Trojan War, and which in turn led to Gallipoli, which took that same place. So I had a whole exhibition linking Leda and Swan to the Australian, to the Anzacs.
Were they sort of fortuitous links, or did they?
No, not the slightest. No. I went to Gallipoli later on, and I could see there from the heights which the Australian and New Zealand soldiers tried to reach. In fact, the New Zealand soldiers did reach a particular height, and from there you can actually see Troy. You can look down, you can see the site of the Battle of Troy and the Scamander River winding there. So that has been a centre point for conflict for thousands of years, and of course it still remains a very strategic point, the Hellespont, that thing there. So you see, I don't know whether all of this stuff is part of a Celtic kind of construction, which I perhaps have in my makeup or in my mind, whereby there was an oral kind of thing in the Irish things, yes, which they kept on, the mothers or the fathers, but mostly the mothers, in fact, telling the boys, telling the girls too, but the men had the chance to utilise the things as the women were busy having families. So it was this oral tradition which I was reared in, and in a way I think it's what I've developed into a way of telling stories in paint, which seemed to be a very banal and old-fashioned thing some years ago. Now it's rather fashionable.
Indeed. Right.
Yeah.
So what did you make of the great period in the 60s of minimal art, things of this sort, where if you made any reference at all to anything figurative, you were sort of dismissed? How do you react to that?
Well, what I did in the 60s, I reacted quite strongly about that. I felt that I'd done that, you see, because when I was younger, in 1938 and 37, 38, 39, 40, for 5 years I was an abstract painter, and I was, I suppose, what you might call a minimalist painter also. I did very tenuous abstract things, and I worked to a minimum thing, and I did that Moon Boy thing in 1940, which is, I suppose,
recurring.
Well, it's still here.
Right.
Well, if you look at it historically and at American hard edge painting, I suppose, in a sense, you're going to, or even though it's a one-off thing, you're going to say that that some American hard edge painting is very like that.
Mm.
So I'd been through all that. So when minimal art turned up, I didn't feel particularly interested, since I'd lived that early in my life. And I set about then reacting against the whole thing and doing a series of quite complicated murals, which was Snake and Paradise Garden and thing. And I spent the boom period, when I should have been making money, doing these enormous murals, which nobody can hang. But I enjoyed it very much, because they were all quite complicated small paintings, which when put together added up to enormous murals.
Right.
That is because I think, it changes the subject a bit, but that was because I think when I was in the early 40s, I think in Melbourne and elsewhere in Australia, I suppose, we were quite influenced by the concept of the Mexican muralists. You see, Rivera and Orozco and Siqueiros, because I had the feel, other people had the feeling too, that Australia, with its climate, with its rather unified culture, in other words, the meat pies in Darwin being the same as in Perth as in Melbourne, the whole thing being very Australian and very single, and with this beautiful light, that we would produce a monumental art and a mural art, and I still believe so. It hasn't perhaps quite arrived, and maybe it won't. Perhaps the world's changed, but anyway, behind my desire to do these giant murals was that. Plus, if I'm not digressing, I'd been to China in '65, and I'd been overwhelmed by the magnitude of that civilization, and I'd also seen some very large murals, one in ceramic of an enormous dragon, very beautiful, and I rather consciously tried to emulate, not to compete, but to try and establish a huge public statement that was actually about very private things, even though there were wildflowers and actually there were quite a lot of Aborigines in them, and chiringas, and also I used everything under the sun, abstracts and faces and all sorts of things. But I was trying to make a public statement that would fit on a big building. Well, it was going to go in the Melbourne Opera House, and I think it actually is. One part of Paradise Garden. It's now hanging in a mining company in Melbourne. But I overstepped the bounds a bit. I've made them too big for any building so far. So you can see that I'm a mixture of having these private things, but with a desire to have a public image available to the public, because I believe, although I don't believe in a one-to-one social connection between art and society, I do believe that that art should be accessible to everybody, that the peasants should have it just as much as the aristocracy. And in Australia, perhaps more than anywhere else I know of in the world, the interest in painting, I mean, they treat their painters here more as one of themselves, or like tennis players or whatever it is. I mean, art is taken, in a sense, more for granted here now. It wasn't always, but it is now, than anywhere else. There's a lot of interest in it, and there's a lot of I think Australians do accept the fact that the paintings do give them a mirror image of what they might be thinking about, which they can't reach in any other way.
Because the narrative form helps that, doesn't it? The fact that you're using this.
Yes, that is a form, and it does help, but it needn't necessarily be like that. It could be in a completely abstract form. You see, in Russia, after 1917, there was a completely abstract. The constructivist school, there was a great school of abstract art with Malevich and those people, and they tried to express the revolution, or something to do with the revolution, in completely abstract terms. So I don't think it need necessarily be in a narrative form. It could be in absolutely abstract form. And the issue is open at this moment. One doesn't know how the century will finish itself. It may be that you'll have a Mozart will turn up, or the equivalent in pain or whatever, who's completely abstract.
Sure.
Or the other way around. He may be like Van Eyck.
Right, indeed.
One can't tell.
Well, how do you rate the present state of Australian art?
Oh, very good. I think per capita, say, head for head, I think there are painters, sticking out of everybody's ears in Australia. They're all over the place, and the standard is very high.
And if you're going to give advice to a young painter, what advice would you give him?
The advice I would give now is that I think it is now a global situation, that the rest of the century will be spent in making a synthesis of what has been a very complex century, in which there have been many styles. There's been a terrific example of Picasso and Guernica and that kind of thing. Obviously, the political situation in the next 20 years is going to become very complex in all parts of the world. There's going to be struggled and all sorts of things. And the art will, seeing that people tend to think in centuries or thousands of years as the millennium, and we're going to come up to 2001,
Sure.
and Kubrick's going to be there, and everything is going to be sorted out at that point, because there will be doubtless a large crisis in the world which will sort it out anyway. So the art will be global, and I think the young painters now should make themselves very much aware of all that's gone on in the past and all that's going on all over the world. And they should get out and have a good look at the rest of the world, or the other way around, see some of the examples of the art that's been brought back. There's a great lot in Sydney of work that's been collected at the university there. And this question of a national art, they also have to take into consideration, because like cooking or like speech or anything else, there is a national twist to everything. But basically, because of all the communication systems and all these things we have now, everything is instant and everything is one. So a painter, like a scientist, in fact very much like a scientist, has to be aware of all the possibilities and the totality of the situation. So they will have to be very sophisticated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.